The insurance issues that attach to the crisis in Japan are critical to consider early in the process of attempting to ascertain how businesses are going to respond to this terrible event. There are a number of different types of insurance policies that may be relevant here, but the primary type of coverage that likely will be important to assist companies who conduct any sort of business in Japan or with companies in Japan, or even indirectly somehow their business model is attached to the Japanese economy, are going to have potential business interruption issues. So the first party business interruption coverage likely will be most relevant with respect to the losses that companies may suffer because of this event. And those policies often are very complicated. They have different language. There are policy forms that you will see, but frequently they're modified for individual companies, and the language can be not uniform amongst policies and very complicated. Those policies also typically have a number of quote-unquote procedural requirements for purposes of triggering the coverage. And when I say procedural requirements, what I mean is typically with respect to notice, once a loss occurs, companies are required to give notice under many policies, quote-unquote, immediately or within some certain period of time. And insurers will argue that if the notice requirements are not strictly complied with, they may have a basis to avoid coverage entirely. As counsel for policyholders, we may have a different point of view and may argue differently, but you certainly, as a policyholder, would not want to be in a position of arguing about whether your notice was timely. The other important next procedural requirement is providing to the insurance company something called a proof of loss. The proof of loss is the first document that the insured is required to provide that includes a discussion of the nature of the loss, an attempt to quantify the loss, and give details to the insurance company about the type of loss that's being suffered. And many insurance policies include within the policy specific information that must be provided. And usually there's a time frame within which a proof of loss must be required. Some policies say 60 days, some policies say 90 days, but there's a specific time requirement. If the policyholder is not aware of the timing requirements with respect to providing a proof of loss, or is not in a position to strictly comply with those timing requirements, the insurer again may later argue that a failure to comply or to provide the requested information would give the insurer a basis to avoid coverage. Often insurers will agree to extend those time frames, but the policyholders obviously need to be aware of the specific time frames so that they can be dialoguing with their insurers and make sure that they are not in any way not complying. There are other procedural requirements within given policies, and so the first advice that we give clients is obviously immediately find all potentially applicable first-party policies and review them carefully to make sure that the companies are aware of the various requirements under the policies for triggering coverage. The other important issue early with respect to this event is so many companies are right now in the process of attempting to determine whether they're going to suffer a loss, the extent of any loss, whether they have supply chain disruptions, and how to change their business activities to avoid any supply chain disruptions, or to make sure that any losses they may suffer because of the events in Japan will be minimized. As they're internally having dialogues about how to address this situation, and even potentially talking to the outside world, maybe consultants or third parties or even the press, it's important to be aware of the specific coverages in their insurance policies, how the policy language works, and what the potential coverage issues are within the policies. For example, if there are exclusions or sublimits that may apply to limit coverage, it is important to be aware of those issues, because any statements that companies make today internally or to the outside world that may not be consistent with the coverage and how it works could potentially later be discovered by an insurance company and used as a basis to avoid coverage. And we saw that happen in connection with Katrina and 9/11 and other disasters. Early internal email communications amongst employees, for example, in which a loss is characterized in a manner that may trigger an exclusion, even if that characterization wasn't necessarily accurate. The insurer later in investigating the claim or in coverage litigation found those emails and tried to use them as a basis to avoid coverage. So the reason that I bring that up is it is very important, although insurance may not be at the very top of the list of things that is being considered right now in determining how to respond to this loss. There are so many potential pitfalls within the insurance policy or issues with respect to coverage that it is important that companies understand all those issues and frame all communications in a manner early that is consistent with maximizing the possibility of recovering under the policy. The coverage claims that will be made will vary. And there are certain companies that presently today are aware of the losses that they are suffering or will suffer because of this event, because they have direct operations in Japan, and they have plants in Japan that are shut down, and therefore their business operations have been already interfered with because of this event. And those companies likely have already pulled out their insurance policies and given notice. If they haven't, then they need to, and hopefully they will very soon. There are other companies that are more indirectly impacted and may not yet appreciate the extent to which this event will cause them business losses. And an example there might be a hotel chain that doesn't have any actual hotels in Japan, but has hotels around the world that rely upon Japanese tourists, Japanese business people, and because there will be a decreased amount of Japanese tourism going forward potentially, they might have a business interruption loss a bit later, and so that may be a more direct loss and not yet ascertainable, and so notice may not yet have been given. But with respect to the companies that have already given notice, they now are in the time frame within which they're going to need to start thinking about the proof of loss. And how that proof of loss is characterized is going to be very important for purposes of ultimately protecting coverage. And so not yet having a full appreciation of how the various provisions within the policy play together with respect to coverage, it could be that that proof of loss may not maximize the opportunity to obtain coverage because it's not being framed in a manner that considers all the potential issues under the policy, the sublimits, the exclusions, the occurrence issue. And so right now, what is most important for companies that have given notice is that they are thinking strategically about how to frame the proof of loss, and when that's ultimately provided, making sure that they have frame their loss in a manner that doesn't in any way impair their ability later to obtain maximum coverage under the policy.